Today we are going to be talking about the Ice Box murders. In June 1965, Houston police received a call from a man by the name of Marvin Marlin. He explained that he was increasingly worried about his elderly aunt, Edwina Rogers, and her husband, Fred. Quite a few days had passed without Marvin being able to get in contact with the couple. He had even gone to their house, but no one answered the door. And so he had a really bad feeling, and Marvin hoped that the authorities would be able to go and do a welfare check and then just pretty much assure him that everything was okay. The Houston police agreed, and on June 23rd around 9 p.m., officers Charles Bullock and L.M. Barta headed to the Rogers residence, having no way of preparing for what they were about to discover. As the officers arrived at 1815 Driscoll Street, they knocked on the door, but just like Marvin, they received no answer. And so they did end up forcing their way into the home. And while doing so, the officers noticed the first strange detail. Several flower pots had been stacked up against the back door, which explained why it was so difficult to open. It was unlocked, but it was just really hard to open. Once inside, Barta headed upstairs while Bullock investigated the first floor. So he noted that Marvin had been right, saying that the Rogers were not the best housekeepers, but an untidy house was nothing unusual or alarming. However, as soon as Bullock stepped into the kitchen, he knew that something was not quite right. There was food molding on the tables, as if Fred and Edwina had been suddenly forced to leave their dinner behind. It wasn't just that. So Officer Bullock had this unexplained feeling that he needed to look in the refrigerator. He opened the door of the 3x5 icebox and discovered it was full of what he had assumed was butchered hog meat. And so, considering that the Rogers had seemingly been gone for days, it was rather weird that their refrigerator was stuffed with food. Bullock had later recalled that he was thinking at that moment how shameful it was that there was a whole bunch of good meat that was going to go to waste. Then, just when he was about to close the door, Bullock had glanced down at the vegetable drawer. To his horror, a pair of eyes were staring right back at him. Officer Bullock reacted to the horrifying sight just like anyone else would have done. He slammed the refrigerator door shut, then he paused for a moment before reopening it to confirm that he had really seen a woman's head. And there it was in the vegetable drawer, and it did seem like a man's head had been stored in the other bin. But while nothing had obviously been confirmed yet, he was pretty sure that the missing couple had now been located. Once backup had arrived, the contents of the icebox were examined more closely. In addition to the heads, the meat and the shelves belonged to Fred and Edwina Rogers. Their bodies had been dismembered and packed into the fridge by someone who had taken their time and knew exactly what they were doing. Autopsies concluded that the Rogers had died 3 days earlier on June 20th, which was Father's Day. Edwina had been shot in the head, execution style, while Fred was bludgeoned to death with a claw hammer. So for one reason or another, the killer had also removed Fred's genitals and gouged out his eyes, making it seem like they may have had something personal against the older man or just men in general. The police also noted that the killer had spent a lot of time cleaning the house and getting rid of any signs of a crime, but there were still a lot of traces of blood left in the master bedroom. Most likely the Rogers had been drained of blood in the bathroom before their bodies were then dismembered into pieces and their organs flushed down the toilet. Some remains were later found in the sewer system, but some parts of the couple were never recovered. In addition to the bathroom, there was only one other place in the house where the investigators found blood, and that was the keyhole of a bedroom. That specific bedroom belonged to a person the police desperately wanted to interview but couldn't locate: Fred and Edwina's son, 43-year-old Charles Rogers. Charles was born in Houston, Texas on December 30th, 1921. He was far from an ordinary man. He studied for a while at Texas A&M University, but eventually he had dropped out, and instead he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in nuclear physics at the University of Houston. He then went on to serve in World War II as a U.S. Navy pilot. Nobody could deny that Charles Rogers who had also spoken 7 languages, was a highly intelligent person. He had talent in many different fields and could have had a long and successful career. And yet, in 1957, he left his job without any explanation and began to live at his parents' house. And even though Charles was unemployed, he would leave home every morning before his parents were awake and return home after dark when his parents were back to sleep. Even many of the neighbors were unaware that Charles lived there. Most of the communication between his parents and Charles happened through paper notes when they would slip it under his bedroom door. So nobody really knew what Charles had been up to during the last 8 years. And now in 1965, nobody even knew where he was. So it definitely did not look good that Charles had completely vanished without a trace at the same time that his parents were found brutally murdered, especially as the police had found a handsaw in his room. A nationwide search for Charles Rogers was launched after an arrest warrant was issued to him as an important witness for this crime. So since the authorities knew that Charles had served as a pilot in World War II, they checked the local airfields, but nobody came forward saying that they had seen a man matching Charles's description. So after the escape with the plane theory did not yield any results, the investigators had next to nothing to work with. So there was no evidence, no trail to follow, no idea of where Charles could have gone, and soon days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months into years without any progress in the case. Somehow Charles had completely disappeared, as if he had never existed in the first place. Eventually, 10 years after the gruesome discovery in the Houston home, Charles Rogers was declared legally dead. Charles's death, however, did not stop people from speculating exactly what happened between him and his parents. So in 1992, authors John R. Craig and Philip A. Rogers published a book called The Man on the Grassy Knoll, in which they introduced the theory that Charles Rogers was actually a CIA agent. According to Craig and Rogers, Charles was one of the so-called tramps spotted in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963, shortly after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, along with the contract killer Charles Harrelson. This theory could explain why Charles behaved so strangely and why he went out every morning despite not having a job. In their book, Craig and Rogers suggested that Fred and Edwina found out about their son's involvement in President Kennedy's death by reading Charles's diaries. Now, Greg says that after the assassination, Charles disappeared for 5 months, and after he returned, his mother began to get suspicious about him. Apparently, Charles was getting calls at home like nonstop, and sometimes his mother was taking messages for him. So after he had been exposed, Charles had no other choice than to kill his parents and flee to Guatemala. This theory, while very interesting, remains unproven with little to no evidence to support it. Another more likely explanation for the murders and Charles's disappearance came from forensic accountants and amateur sleuths Hugh and Martha Gardner. In their 2003 book, The Icebox Murders, the couple had began investigating the case back in '97 and eventually came to the conclusion that Charles did kill his parents, but for a completely different reason. According to them, they state that Fred and Edwina Rogers were actually horrible parents who abused their son for years and defrauded Charles by forging his signature on property deeds. Allegedly, Edwina took out loans on their house that their son Charles owned, and she used the money however she pleased, while Fred would gamble and torment Charles. Eventually, Charles snapped under the constant emotional and physical abuse, and he butchered his parents. So the special attention given to Fred's body could be explained by the grudge that Charles felt for his father. So according to them, shortly after the Icebox murders, a man looking like Charles was overheard asking about a job overseas. So following their investigation, Hugh and Martha suggested that Charles may have actually used his connections in the oil industry from his years working at the Shell Oil Company to escape to Mexico. But they said that Charles Rogers died long time ago, claiming that he was killed by a pickaxe lodged in his head after a wage dispute involving some miners in Central America. So it is totally possible that the Gardners are right and Charles killed his parents after years of abuse and started a new life elsewhere. But again, there is no evidence to support those claims, and for that reason, the book, The Icebox Murders, has been called a work of fact-based fiction. Today, nearly 60 years have passed since the day Officer Bullock opened the icebox door at 1815 Driscoll Street and discovered the heads of Fred and Edwina Rogers. While many theories of what happened to them and their son have surfaced over the years, we still do not know for sure if Charles killed his parents, and if he did, why and where he went. Unfortunately, after all of this time, it is likely that the Icebox Murders will remain one of Houston's most notorious unsolved cases. Charles Rogers has most certainly taken all of the answers to his grave.